Sorry? Oh, just a couple of days. That's good. I stay with my managing director. We're in this very nice, funky old chateau. 35 euros for bed and breakfast. It's down the road. So sometimes run by a lovely old couple who unfortunately are retiring and trying to sell it. That's got to be a minute.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to start in 30 seconds. Can everyone settle down, please? Going to have 30 seconds and then we're on. Thank you very much.
Okay, welcome to Riverford at the Duke of Cambridge and our how much meat debate. I'm a vegetable grower and a vegetable enthusiast, but my whole life has actually been tied up with livestock, and I just thought I'd explain a little bit how we came to be here tonight and perhaps why. So my dad gave me a pig for my 8th birthday and said, go away and make some money with that, and she was a very profitable pig. By 10 I was selling well-rotted manure from the garden gate. That was my first successful enterprise. By 12 I had a flock of sheep, and my brother is a butcher. My other brother and sister are dairy farmers. My father was a lifetime enthusiast for keeping pigs. But I did turn out to be a vegetable grower in the end, despite all that. But even as a vegetable grower, my life continues to be tied up with livestock. We are completely dependent on their manures, and our rotation in Devon, where our soils aren't terribly fertile, generally relies on 2 or 3 years of a grass clover lay to build up the fertility before we grow a vegetable crop. And to make that economically viable, we need to be grazing it with livestock. Recently we do also sell meat as well as our vegetable boxes. So as I say, I'm totally tied up in livestock agriculture, despite the fact that I love vegetables and find meat a bit boring, actually, when it comes to eating it. But anyway, 30 years on, and I mean, I spent 30 years, I guess, trying to run a business ethically, trying to feed people sustainably with a minimum of environmental impact. When I say sustainably, I mean economically sustainably as well as environmentally. It has to. Farmers and their workers do have to be able to make a living, and I like to think that we do that enjoyably as well. But so, how did the whole meat thing came about? It came about really by harassment from my children, actually. Having watched Cowspiracy, first one of them came up to me, Dad, how can you call yourself an environmentalist and still be selling meat? And then the other 3 joined in, and in the end I sat down and watched the thing. I don't know how many people here have watched it. It is an exceedingly irritating documentary, I think. If ever there was someone of selecting the information to support your argument rather than forming an argument based on the information, the Cowspiracy is that. And it ends up by attacking Greenpeace, which irritated me even more. But it does make some valid points. I mean, I guess the prime one being that collectively we eat more meat, far more meat than is sustainable for our planet. And the second point, that this is a neglected issue, really. I mean, I didn't hear anything, at the Paris climate change talks discussing livestock and meat consumption. So I sat down and did a lot of research and ended up getting more confused and frustrated than anything else. A lot of the issues are, I mean, what are we measuring when we start talking about livestock? I mean, climate change, yes, we can argue about the figures. Is it a fair and sustainable use of land when, you heard a lot of arguments over the last 5 years about how we're going to feed 11 billion people. I suggest that livestock's not a very good way of doing it. In most cases, arguments about welfare, antibiotic use and resistance, biodiversity, and indeed our own health. I guess I'm going to concentrate mainly on climate change. I spent a lot of time looking on the internet, reading various papers, and it's very hard to draw categorical conclusions, I find. I mean, partly because they all seem to be measuring different things. Do you include the effect of changing land use? People argue a lot about the benefits of grassland and whether that should be set against the emissions from grazing livestock. I suspect some of these things are going to come out in the discussion this evening, but there are widely differing estimates of the contribution of livestock to climate change. Cowspiracy put it at 51% of anthropogenic climate change being attributable to livestock agriculture. I would suggest that was ridiculous. I've read it as estimates as low as 7%. The UN FAO estimates it at 14.5%, which I suspect is a bit on the low side, but it's probably somewhere near. To put that in context, about the same as all transport globally. I think anyway, I'm never quite clear how much of the land use change is factored into those things. Just before we start the debate, I've had a discussion actually mainly with my staff, and a lot of the discussion centered around ruminants, and so I'm going to tell you what a ruminant is, because a few of you might have forgotten your GCSE or O-level biology. A ruminant is the stomach of a cow, a sheep, a bison, a goat, and it typically accounts for 20 to 25% of the body weight of those species, and it allows them to very efficiently digest fibre, grass, clover, and other things. So it makes them good at digesting grass, but I would suggest pretty bad at digesting grain and soya. And in there, because it's an anaerobic environment, there's no oxygen, that's where the whole enteric emissions, that's the methane belching and possibly occasionally farting comes from. So that, anyway, I just thought I'd clear that one up just in case anyone didn't know what a rumen was. And I just want to make the point, it is an incredibly complex issue. I mean, to say that all meat is bad, I think is a gross oversimplification. Varies hugely between species. I'm sure that'll come out, and between production systems. Just to give you an indication of that, if you take out the lowest 5% the worst 5% and the best 5% of beef production, the difference between the top and the bottom is still a factor of 5, according to how the livestock is being kept. So it's very dependent on the system and also the species. And I really don't think we should forget that we live in a small island. You know, this is a global issue, and the way we keep our livestock and the justification for that, I think, is very different here. And I think we should be wary of exporting the conclusions to. I spent a fair amount of time in Uganda, where typically, a family might have one cow, and it's absolutely essential to maintaining the fertility of their holding and their health in all sorts of ways. I think that's very different to argue against that compared to argue against a mega dairy. And I think at that point I'm going to hand you over to our able chair, Xanthi, to get the debate going.
Good evening and welcome everybody. It's great to see you all here, and welcome also to everybody who's watching on YouTube as well. Thank you for joining us. That was a great introduction. Thank you very much, Guy. And my name's Xanthi Clay. I'm your chair for this evening. I've been a food writer for the last 17 years. Before that, I was a chef, and before that, I was vegetarian for 10 years. So I've been a meat eater and not a meat eater as well. And I think I agree, it's a very important topic. I'd like to introduce our two panellists for this evening, or in fact ask them to introduce themselves, very illustrious. First of all, Tim Lang.
forgot to pick up his microphone. Hello, I'm Tim Lang, and I'm Professor of Food Policy, literally down the road at City University London.
Thank you for coming. And Tim, how much meat have you eaten this week?
Well, that's very easy, none, because I gave up meat in the mad cow disease issue. But I was, as I always remind people in this debate, I was a sheep farmer and a Welsh black pedigree cattle farmer in the 1970s. So I've killed a lot of animals.
And Peter Melchett.
I'm an organic farmer in Norfolk, arable crops and beef cattle, and I'm Policy Director of the Soil Association.
And how much meat have you eaten in the last week?
None, because I've been a vegetarian since Mrs. Thatcher was elected. I'm not sure if they're connected or not. It's because of Peter Singer's book, Animal Liberation, convinced me to be a vegetarian, my partner and I. And our kids are both meat eaters.
And actually, just to round that off, Guy, how much meat have you eaten this week?
I was doing pretty well until lunchtime. I did have a bit of lamb at lunch.
Fantastic.
How much have you eaten?
How much have I eaten? Well, I'm trying to think. I had a bite of a duck confit sandwich yesterday. Does that count? Exactly, 2 carnivores, 2 not. So we've got some questions which have come from us, to us via Twitter. So we're going to start with those, and then afterwards I'm going to open the floor to questions from the audience. So the first question comes from @Barrett_Millie. And the question is, in terms of environmental sustainability and carbon footprint, which meat is the most sustainably produced in the UK? And I'm going to start by asking Tim that question.
I thought I might be the first. This all depends on what we mean by sustainable. I am someone who is known for, and still thinks is right, to argue that by sustainable we mean multi-criteria. It's not just carbon. It's water, it's biodiversity, it's land use, some of the things that Guy referred to. But it's also got a social dimension, and as Guy said, it's an economic dimension, but I think it's also about quality. And to some extent, the question we're asking tonight, how much meat, the answer is very simple, less. Less as a population. It has to be less in the rich world. All the calculations show that. So by sustainable, it depends what level we're looking at. Are we looking at global level? Are we looking at population level? Or are we looking at you or me? I think mostly the argument, the evidence points to the British, say, Guy's constituency, Riverford buyers, need to eat less. But that's partly to allow a notional average, which is sustainable in the long term as defined by the UN. The FAO has done this. Showed that actually we ought to reduce dramatically what Americans and Europeans eat and allow developing countries to consume slightly more to get to a notional average, something like that. But overall, the climate change impact, the water use, land use, grain use of animals producing meat needs to come down dramatically.
Sheep, pig, lamb.
I would say grass-fed. Got to be grass-fed. The main trouble for people like me, academics looking at this, is that 40% in some countries of the grain grown in the world is fed to animals. This is hugely inefficient land use. So rule number 1 is grass-fed rather than grain-fed. That has to be, whichever you're doing. I would say
pigs
sheep,
fed on waste?
Pigs fed on waste, but that's problematic because the waste, as you know, waste has been a big problem of source of disease, but I'm someone who supports the argument we've got to get waste being used by pigs again, because I think that's a good use of waste. Even if you anaerobically digest it, you've got to then use the byproducts. So I'm someone who says less beef, more towards poultry. That's what most academics say, but it depends how they're reared and how much. It's always the key things, Anthony, is how much.
And that's exactly the question that I would like to see answered this evening, because we hear a lot of less meat, and I think most of us agree we should be eating less meat. But I, for one, don't know what that means. Is that twice a week? Is that a 4-ounce steak, or is that an 8-ounce steak? Is that a chicken breast, or is that half a chicken breast? I'd really love to see some specifics come out of this conversation.
Well, the famous paper by Tony McMichael and John Powles, one Australian, one British, and their colleagues, calculated, in fact, Anthony Froggatt over there. Anthony, do you remember that paper? No, he's looking blank. Hopeless. hopeless. Never look. I never asked. I shouldn't have asked you. It's something like 70 grams a week per person as a notional average, down to that.
Wow, so that's
Something that
2.5 ounces.
A lot less than you're eating.
Quite a little steak. But
Very small.
Peter,
It's
do you...
a paper by Tony McMichael. If anyone wants it, I can send it to you.
Peter,
Yeah, a small burger a day, something like that.
how would your business manage
Tiny.
if we all
Well,
reduced to that?
First of all, I was going to answer the question, which Tim
Please do, please do.
Tim went nowhere near, which was, which meat is the most sustainably produced in the UK? And I would say a good example would be beef from a traditional breed like a red pole in Norfolk, grazing coastal marshes, a permanent grassland, which provide enjoyment for thousands of people, bird watchers and others, and a habitat for thousands of birds, pinkfoot geese and Brent geese at this time of year, bittern, avocets, all sorts of other birds in spring and summer. And so I'm agreeing with what Tim said about the multifaceted nature of sustainability. You can't just measure one thing, and Guy's quite right. What we measure and where we draw the boundaries are absolutely crucial to the discussion. But none of that should make it difficult to give a clear answer to a straightforward question. And traditional breeds of sheep and beef grazing grassland which is permanent and which doesn't receive nitrogen fertilizer, so it's either extensive grazing, like grazing marshes or upland areas, or it's grass with clover in, so it's providing its own fertility and not releasing nitrogen. That's the most sustainable. A chicken eating waste around the farmyard would be similar, but any chicken, I would say, fed protein and grain is going to be down the list. Red meat, grass-reared, grass-finished, as long as the grass hasn't got nitrogen fertilizer on it, and as long as the grass is storing carbon in the soil and combating climate change, that's the best.
Thank you. And thank you for keeping me on the straight and narrow. You're quite right. Failed as a chairwoman already. Guy, do you have anything?
I didn't answer the question you put to me.
Guy, have you got anything to add to the question?
I'll say again, it does depend what you're measuring, but I don't think you can duck the issue that on climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, on a full life cycle analysis, a beef and lamb is the worst. One can argue, well, I'll come back to the arguments about that, followed probably then, if you're talking, we really should talk about animal protein and include dairy and eggs in this as well, I think. So probably followed by hard cheese and butter, followed by pork, followed by chicken, followed by eggs. That's what most of the reports will tell you. What they haven't factored into that is what I think Peter is getting at. You should possibly weigh against that the benefits of grassland in terms of sequestering carbon. And that, I mean, I haven't seen any figures which really calculate that properly, but my suggestion would be that puts grass-fed dairy and lamb and beef down somewhere next to the chickens and pigs. The reality is that 99.9% of chickens and pigs in the developed world are fed grain and soya. They're not scratching around the chicken yard. When you go and buy an egg or a chicken or a sausage, that's what you're buying. That's a decision you make when you go to a shop. So I think that's what we should be measuring. But that is only in climate change terms. If you talk about biodiversity, as Peter is, you can talk about animal welfare. Everyone in this room probably has a different set of values. It is hideously complicated.
Thank you. And I think we'll move on to the next question now, which is from Tom Lloyd, 86. And this question, I'd like you to answer this first, which is, what will happen to our countryside if we don't rear animals for meat or dairy?
Well, it depends what you decide to do. I mean, it's perfectly possible to keep animals in the countryside and not kill them. wait for them to die. We have on the grazing marsh I was talking about just now 5 wild horses, conics, from Poland, because there are bits of the marsh which are so wet that it's difficult for the cattle to keep the vegetation down and keep the interest for wildlife in that area up. So we put the conics, the horses, but we don't eat them. They cost us a fortune, and they have to be put to sleep to have their hooves trimmed, because they're wild. They are actually wild. They're charming and lovely animals. And we could have, and there are farmers. There's a farmer who's involved with the Soil Association who has buffalo, conics, and cattle and sheep and deer roaming across thousands of acres. They may kill a few for meat, I'm not sure, but there's no need to. You just wait for them to die of old age and breed replacements. So nothing need happen, but in practice we would lose, I think, the possibility of returning to, I wouldn't say we've got it now, a countryside much fuller of life and colour and movement and interesting and varied jobs. Because if you get rid of all factory farming, get rid of all those pigs and chickens in concentration camps, and you just have outdoor livestock which is fed primarily on grass, even the chickens and pigs can have a high proportion of grass and insects in their diet, you then have a countryside full of movement and life. It employs more people. The meat becomes self-imposed, more expensive, and you're going to eat much less of it. Chicken becomes a luxury. I know people get bored, people my age saying this, but you know, when I was a kid after the war, we had chicken at most once a week, and it lasted 4 or 5 days. You've all heard those sorts of stories. It's actually true in Arca. I remember it distinctly. Ending up with chicken soup, you know, on the 5th day or something. And that's what chicken should be. It is a luxury. And you're not paying for it if you buy a non-organic and intensively produced chicken, but the climate is, all the wildlife that lives in the Brazilian rainforest is paying, all the wildlife that depends on rangelands in Brazil and Argentina is paying, all the people who are sprayed with Roundup in those countries are paying, and their unborn babies are paying. They're paying a huge price.
I'm just going to move you back to the question.
No. I thought I could get away with it if Tim did. Yeah, what's the question? What will the countryside?
What will happen to our countryside?
Oh, and I wanted to say, yes.
Will we dig it up for vegetables?
As an ex-president of the Ramblers Association, some of it would get more difficult to walk in, because there would be areas which we now walk in because they're grazed, and that you have wonderful places to walk in the Lake District. I'm about to go on holiday with my family and grandchildren, which would, if they weren't grazed, and they should be grazed by far fewer sheep than there are now, but if they weren't grazed at all, would scrub up and then would become woodland. So it would be a less accessible and less interesting, and I think less joyful countryside.
Tim, I feel you've got something to say here.
I disagreed. Peter and I are old friends, but argue. I think to answer the question, to give a short answer, I think we'd rewild a lot of countryside. I think there's a really big argument for rewilding. Where I farmed in Lancashire, we had 2,000 acres of common land behind 105 acres. That could, instead of being grazed by sheep, which is what we did with 300 sheep, and our neighbours likewise, it could be trees. It would be sequestering carbon. It would be rewilding. It would be good for the hen areas. It would have been fantastic for improvement of life. Exactly what Peter said. But I think
hen harriers need open ground.
They do need open ground. But that the Forest of Bowland, where I was, has lots of open in the bottoms. But the point about it is that we can actually think creatively about land use. We don't have to use so much land for animals. It can be used for other things. But the main thing
like
that
what?
I wanted, horticulture. If there's one thing we should be talking about, it's not meat, it's actually Guy's area of how to increase horticulture in Britain. We don't produce enough. We produce exactly 10% of the fruit that we consume, exactly 50% of the vegetables we consume, and we should be eating double of those.
And
that's
shockingly,
what
that's
land
going
should be
down.
used.
Those figures are reducing.
Well, they're not rising enough. they vary, and they're terrible in young people. So for me, the answer to the question of Tom Lloyd 86 is more wilding, more trees, but also the best land for horticulture.
Guy?
What are we going to do with all that land? But what a wonderful luxury that would be. I mean, you know, we could rewild some of it. We could grow trees on some of it. We could have more hedgerows, better looked after, more diversity. Instead of trying to produce more all the time, we might have the luxury of leaving a field or two and not cutting it for silage and allowing ground nesting birds to thrive. I mean, there are so many wonderful things we could do with our countryside, you know, other than, well, you know, sometimes overgrazing sheep, you know, on some hill farms that I walk across, you know, at huge environmental and taxpayers' cost. I have to say, none of them would be there at all without the taxpayer. You're all paying for them. I mean, most of those farms are completely unviable, given the market as it is. The market would, of course, change if these what we're proposing happen. So, you know, I don't think we should view it as a problem. I think we should view it as a wonderful and exciting luxury.
So, moving on. And this question from @Nicola R. Ledsham. It's difficult to imagine a sizable shift happening through consumer demand alone. How do we overcome this? Question for you, Tim.
Well, I'm a policy person. I think one of the problems we've got in this discussion, we shouldn't, with great respect to Guy and Riverford, this should not be Guy and Riverford. This should be a national debate. This should be clear policy guidelines coming from government. We have policy guidelines on nutrition, but they will not engage with the environment, and they will not engage with the big transition that we've got to take. So for me, the most important answer is that actually this requires government to be government. And at the moment, government has spent 40 years across all parties of shifting responsibility onto consumers and market relations, as though there isn't a framework. Guy referred to farmers getting subsidies. That's essentially the Common Agricultural Policy. And before the CAP, we subsidised in different ways in Britain. So the policy problem is the one that I think has got to be fixed. And then within that, we consumers actually have got to change. One of the reasons the politicians don't want to engage with this area is because they're frightened of being seen to tell us what to do. They have this obsession about the nanny state, as though there aren't nannies being used in the state through the form of the state all the time in lots of things. Here is something where consumers genuinely want advice and are getting nothing. So that's what I want. I want government to be government, I want policy frameworks, and I want, above all, as Guy and Peter know, I want sustainable dietary guidelines. I want the Food Standards Agency that currently sets advice on fish and meat and vegetables and fruit and nuts now, very important, nut production. That's what we should be growing more of, Guy, by the way. There's really good evidence on that. I want you to plant nuts. Not to go nuts, but to plant them. But we need to have that nutrition guidelines to have an environmental basis.
So a meat equivalent of the 5 a day campaign?
Yeah, 5 a day has not been useful. It was a political choice by the Americans, and we just imported it. The evidence is much stronger when it becomes 7 a day, or the Greeks say 9 a day, actually. And but then if you start eating that amount of fruit and vegetables, you're quite full.
So how?
So that reduces the meat, which is a very good thing. So policy, sustainable dietary guidelines, and the broad message is eat less meat but better if you want to eat meat, and eat more fruit and vegetables and nuts.
70 grams. You heard it here.
That's the Michael and Pulse. That is used very heavily in the academic world now as the benchmark. And you weigh up your own amount of meat you're eating, and it's a lot more than that if you're a meat eater.
Peter?
I, of course, agree with what Tim says, and the basic change we need to make to our diets on climate change and human health and wildlife and animal welfare, all of those grounds and others are the same, and it's fairly simple, as Tim says: more fruit and vegetables, less but better quality meat and dairy. I would say the better quality is best represented by organic. And we've had recent nutritional evidence which supports that for both fruit and veg and for meat and dairy. But I think there is something else. The Soil Association's been working for about nearly 15 years now on school meals and hospital food and food in the high street, children's food. And we've seen huge changes. We published a report back in about 2003 which called school food muck off a truck. And it was disgusting, absolutely unbelievable. I've stood in a primary school dining room with a head teacher looking at the kids, like all of you sitting there, and seen not a single teacher, and said to their teacher, "I don't see any of your colleagues eating the food here." And the head teacher turned to me and said, "You don't think we'd eat that muck, do you?" And I had kids in primary school at the time, and I felt outraged. And so the thing that struck me about this campaign and the work Jamie Oliver did, brilliant work, and continues to do, is the secrecy. How hidden what happens to our food, what's in it, how it's produced on farms, how closed off that became in the period from the end of the Second World War onwards. And this is what people feel. We know from social scientific research, people feel that something's been done secretive, you wouldn't like it. That's why Guy's newsletters, for example, I find absolutely amazing, because you're told exactly what's going on, including the bad bits, which I enjoy reading as a fellow farmer more than the good bits, I have to say. So I think we can open up the information about how things are produced, where they come from. In the program we do in schools, all the children have to visit a farm, they have to learn to grow food, they have to learn to cook. Then you talk about changing diets and how people eat in the circumstances.
So get them while they're young.
Show them how the meat is reared and killed.
Well, if we
that
could,
becomes very tricky with
yes,
kids.
getting children to go to an abattoir, but just standing in front of a group of
Not many
outdoor
consumers. How many people have been to an abattoir? Sorry.
Hey, that's a pretty amazing proportion.
That's a
Huge
very
number.
high proportion. Very high proportion. Yeah, I bet it's one.
Tim, just talking to kids about this is in front of a group of pigs and piglets, about this is where sausages come from, this is where your pork, this is bacon.
So we're talking about how we can shift, how we can make the big change, and whether it needs more than simply consumer demand.
I think consumer demand can bring about change. I mean, with battery hens, it might have taken 30 years, and it is sort of the argument that everybody uses. So perhaps that it's not a great example because everyone uses the same example, but it did work with battery hens. I mean, consumer power, but I do think the government should be prepared to use tax. I mean, the reason we don't put VAT on food is because, it's an essential. I don't think meat is an essential. I don't think it's a very broad, blunt instrument, but I don't see why it shouldn't carry VAT. That seems, and the Common Agricultural Policy is shaping what happens in our countryside every day through the tax that we pay and the subsidies that farmers receive. And I don't see why that, I would like to see that go more towards the agri-environment side rather than the welfare side, whereby farmers are more or less paid to paid to do very little actually to carry on as normal. We should be using the taxpayers' money to get what we want from the countryside.
Which actually leads us to the next question, which is from @ReflectedEye, and which is very apposite as well in the light of today's sugar tax being announced. Do you think we need a premium on the price of meat to discourage people from buying as much?
Well, I think if meat production carried the full cost, this argument, and so repeated as well, that most of the costs of destructive production processes are not carried by the person doing the production, but by the rest of you. So costs of pesticide use are paid by all of you in your water bills, as water companies desperately try and get these more and more poisonous and difficult to detect chemicals out of what you drink. And the same is true of meat. If we paid the full cost, the climate cost of taking that soya from Brazil and stuffing it into feedlot beef in North America or intensive pigs and chicken production here, then they would cost more if the animals were kept in decent conditions. As I said earlier, a chicken would be a luxury which you would, even on a middle class income, buy once a week or once a fortnight.
So true cost.
True cost would do it, and I think cost is important, and it's grossly distorted at the moment with the most destructive elements of our food costing the least.
So we're talking about, rather than an added premium, we're just talking about true cost here.
Well, that would be one way of doing it, an added premium is another, and then that tax goes back to pay for the cleaning of water. I don't know how it's done, but we at the moment, the healthiest, best food costs most per calorie and the rest of it, very often, and the most destructive food, the nastiest stuff, costs least. Got a friend from America who said the whole of the American agricultural subsidy system was designed to keep a burger and fries at $1.99.
Well, that sounds likely. Tim?
I'm an unusually happy professor today because we've had a right-wing, fairly brutal government suddenly pull a rabbit out of the hat on the sugar tax. And I'm one of the angry professors who helped launch Action on Sugar. We've campaigned ruthlessly to get something to happen. So I'm actually very happy today. But having said that, on my own side on that issue, and I'll come to meat in 10 seconds, none of us think that a tax on sugar is going to resolve the obesity issue. It is a factor, it's a breakthrough, it's a recognition there is a big problem, and soft drinks are too cheap. Exactly the same arguments I think applies on meat. Meat pricing, although I'm a supporter and understand the true cost argument, internalizing the externalized costs into the real cost of meat, on its own, that won't resolve it. There has to be a cultural dimension. I'm a policy man, I'm a social scientist. You can happily say, Xanthi, you would say that. But it's true. People will eat food, whatever the price, actually, if culturally that's what they want to do. Exactly an aspect that the politicians are very frightened of. But the truth is, British food culture has changed dramatically in the last 50 years. British children think pizza is their food. They don't even think it came from Italy. And they think, believe it or not, it comes from a deep freeze, not even Italy. So, culture is malleable. Culture can change. And I go back to my previous point. We don't have good cultural rules. I don't mean rules from nanny state. I mean guidance, assumptions, what social scientists call norms, that when you go into a shop or go into a restaurant or here eat in this pub, is your assumption to have the meat as a meal or to have the vegetarian? That's what the shift we've got to do. So price on its own doesn't make that cultural shift. It can point in that direction, but there has to be. This is a cultural argument.
So having talked about consumers, I'd like to go back to farmers again and ask a question from @TalkingGrass, which is, how can we encourage farmers to produce quality meat from animals that are never fed grain?
The main driver for farmers producing livestock, I would say, is going to be demand. So we need to create a demand for that in retail and in eating out and so on. And there's a pasture-fed livestock association which is encouraging the production of meat, beef and lamb, and dairy products from animals which are reared and finished on grass. Organic doesn't quite get there because it's not 100% grass. It's 70% of the diet should be forage, grass or silage or hay, which is a huge step compared to most of the meat you eat. But I think it's good. Farmers are going to change, partly, as Guy says, Tim says, in response to the financial signals they get from the Common Agricultural Policy, which is not just keeping hill farmers going nowadays, it's keeping pretty much all farmers going, apart from vegetable growers. But arable farmers are selling...
No subsidy.
You've got no subsidy, but arable farmers are selling their crops. Wheat, for example, about £50 a tonne below the cost of production. Dairy farmers, everyone's heard about the desperate plight there, is non-organic. So the subsidies, the payments from the Common Agriculture Policy can make a difference, and the demand. And if you look at how more intelligent countries are moving in this direction, countries like Denmark or Sweden, they're doing it first of all through what the government buys. So you have policies where 25% of all food must be organic. Now, that will make meat more expensive because organic meat is quite a bit more expensive than non-organic, as you'll have seen from Guy's excellent meat boxes, which as a vegetarian I don't touch, but I'm sure they're very good. And so you can have 25 up to 60% even of public money going on organic food. In Copenhagen, it's 100%. And you start to use the power of the public purse in things like schools and hospitals, care homes, police canteens. Big row in New York when they banned Coca-Cola vending machines outside fire stations as part of an effort to make, as Tim was saying, change the norms, change what's expected. But that's when the mayor of New York did that, we had a Coca-Cola vending machine in Guy's Hospital in London outside the nutrition department. So we have a long way to go to change those norms.
No. Guy?
People do need to know what they're buying, and at the moment I would suggest that organic is the best show in town in terms of ensuring that it is quality and grass-fed. But as Peter's pointed out, it's not perfect, and as a vegetable grower I feel somewhat let down, as a matter of fact. I really don't. I think the rules should be tighter within the Soil Association. I think 90% of a dairy cow's diet should come from forage, and probably 95% of a beef animal and 100% of a lamb, and I would like to see that part of the standards. But I don't suppose that's going to happen. But so we do have the Pasture-Fed Livestock Association, which I would support. Yeah, and because quite frankly, a lot of butchers I've spoken to, I wouldn't really believe them when they tell me it's grass-fed. I know there are honest butchers, but there are also dishonest butchers who will look you in the eye and tell you what they think you want to hear. So, I think there has to be some form of certification, and to convey back from customers, what they want to buy as pressure from producers. I don't know whether John, we've got John from the Pasture-Fed Livestock Association. I don't know whether you'd like to add to that.
Well, simply to say that.
Could you take a microphone?
I'm John Meadley, I'm chair of the Pasture-Fed Livestock Association. We do have a certification scheme which is audited at the farm level for wholly pasture-fed ruminant livestock production. That is the first in UK and I think the first in Europe. So if you want to buy pasture-fed, you can do. We've also just published a booklet called Pasture for Life, It Can Be Done, where we looked at the economics of raising cattle and sheep wholly on pasture, and it competes extremely well with grain-fed, and this was done together with the government's economists, so this is not our own thing. And we're just doing pilots on Pasture for Life milk with 6 farms, and I'm hoping that within the next 6 months you'll be able to purchase Pasture for Life milk, which is 100% fed on pasture, nothing else. So I just want to say one other thing about externalities, which is it's not just livestock that create these problems. ADHD and all these kinds of things. It's to do with the pesticides that go into crops and all the rest of it. And yesterday I was at Sheepdrover Farm, which is a large livestock farm, organic, where over the last 5 years the organic matter in the soil has gone up from 6 to 12%. Due to the way they've managed the pasture, the biodiversity, the cattle. And if you think there's 200,000 litres of water for every 1% organic matter, all of these things, and the earthworm count is right up. So cattle, they have huge involvement in the ecosystem. I don't want to overstay my welcome. But Pasture for Life, look for it.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you very
John.
much. So, one more question here from Catherine Cooper. And the question is, what will happen to conventional farmers if a lot of people cut their meat intake and always buy organic?
they'll become horticulturalists and start growing vegetables and fruit and nuts.
They'll become organic
Nuts.
horticulturalists.
I'll go nuts.
Yeah, I mean, you can answer that question by looking at a country like Austria, where 25% of the farmland is organic. That's what happens. Instead of less than 4% here, you'd have 25% and then 50% of the farms, and then 75%. And then, and I've told my son this actually, I'm going to retire from the farm, which he wants me to do, and thinks it's long overdue, which he's now running. When we get to the point that we decide to convert back from organic to conventional, so that we can provide this tiny minority of customers, largely shopping in shops like Fortnum Masons and Harrods, who want to buy pesticide-laden food. Because that's what will happen. That will become the minority, the oddity, and then it will go.
Guy?
Well, it would be wonderful if more of them did become organic, of course. But I mean, I think we have to be realistic about who our farmers are today. There are very few small dairy farmers left. You know, my father started milking 20 cows when my brother and I took over. We had 2 herds of 100. Now we're milking 300, and we're actually relatively small. You know, most dairy herds, you know, well, increasingly dairy herds are milking 300, 400, 500 cows. A hell of a lot of the milking is done by East Europeans because they're the only ones who want to do it on the whole. And they are sort of big businesses. I know there are small farmers, particularly sheep and beef, who probably people would love to support, but the reality of agriculture is that it is becoming increasingly centralised, and I don't know.
Going back to the question, which is if
right.
if
Well,
a
I
lot of
suppose
people cut their meat intake, what will happen to all those meat farmers?
Sorry, I did ramble on a bit there, didn't I? There are lots of other. They could be maintaining the hedgerows, for instance.
That'd be profitable.
Well, if they were paid to do it, it would be. Yeah, I mean, they're paid to produce food which is damaging the environment, and a lot of people don't want to buy it. Anyway, I'm digging in a deep hole for myself here, because I do have a lot of friends who are farmers, and I better shut up.
Tim.
Can I just answer Guy's question about our standards? I think I ought to represent the Soil Association. Should we tighten the standards? I think there are good arguments for pushing the way in which organic meat is produced, both chickens and pigs, where I don't think the standards meet either animal, ideal animal welfare or dietary requirements. And I think the same is true, Guy says, on beef and sheep. You would also need, I think, to change the breeds which farmers use to produce things like milk and beef. And the most interesting thing, which is hinted at in the latest nutrition studies, where there's been a meta-analysis looking at all the individual researches comparing organic and non-organic milk and meat, is that breed as well as diet plays a part in the quality of the meat. So if you want more omega-3 fatty acids and less saturated fatty acids, it may not be just a question of changing the diet, but also looking at the genetics and the breeds, which is why I picked up the Norfolk Red Poll at the beginning of the year.
Interesting. Now, Tim, do you have anything to add?
No, I think I'll just repeat what I've said already. So let's go to another question.
Well, I have a question, Tim, particularly for you. We've talked, and I'm going back to this point, I know I'm sounding like a stuck record, but we've talked a lot about reducing meat intake. You've talked about government taking a lead and government campaigning and giving clear guidelines. I'd love to hear what your clear guidelines are for all of us here today.
Well, firstly, it's whatever the meat guidelines are. I mean, the Scientific Advisory Committee on Nutrition, SACN, did a report on meat and actually reduced the amount of meat that was available, but kept it there. The nutritionists are worried about removing meat altogether, mainly because of micronutrients, iron in particular, at certain times, young women, and so on. I would like those guidelines to have an environmental bent to them, and to a lens put onto those. That's the main thing that I would like to have at the moment.
So how would
because that at the moment we're just all making individual choices.
And
There's not that general shift in the direction of travel of the British food system. Farmers are being paid to farm in the way that they're already farming, and it's a treadmill, and as Guy has said, Peter's alluded, more go out of business. You have to get bigger to do to survive at all, and that's not helping consumers at all.
But
not at all.
And I'd love to have your help for consumers. How would you see that poster in Tesco's or Sainsbury's or Morrison's or Asda? Have I covered them mostly?
Eat meat 2-3 times a week maximum. Eat vegetables, fruit, nuts all the time maximum. Eat grains, obviously. You know, eat everything. Use meat as flavour. Use meat as flavour. Keep it on the edge. Think biodiversity.
So meat 2 or 3 times a week. Do we mean?
No, the poster should say, don't shop in Tesco's, buy a Riverford box.
Very good.
That's easy. That's easy.
It's also a better answer than all that complicated stuff.
So when you say eat meat 2 or 3 times a week, when I make a pot of baked beans, I might put a little bit of chopped bacon in. Will that count as one of my times of eating meat, or is that kind of, is that extra?
That's why you start having to weigh how much meat you buy a week.
So how much meat should I be buying a week?
Well, I've said, follow Anthony, Tony.
So we are 70 grams.
Yeah, you're 70 grams.
Thank you. So 70 grams split between 2 or 3 meals.
But it all depends. We're back to Guy's opening remarks. He's a very wise man, if you didn't know that it's very complicated. It depends how the meat's been reared, what it's been fed on, where it is, and which breed. So, you know, these are ballpark figures. What we need is the Scientific Advisory Committee on Nutrition to actually do its job. And I speak now, I start getting angry as a professor. I was the government advisor for Commissioner for Sustainable Development for the government from 2006 to 11, and we had the government agreed to start producing that advice. The Food Standards Agency had done a project called Integrated Advice to Consumers, and the moment the coalition government came in, they dropped it. They did not want the consumers to have that information. And this is absolutely outrageous. And so for me, it has to begin back at that, to restart that process. Get the Scientific Advisory Committee to do its job, the Food Standards Agency to do its job. It's after 20 years since the Royal Commission on Environmental Pollution, which was abolished as well, said we've got to sort out the issue of fish. Eventually the Food Standards Agency did start saying, well, please will you eat your 2 portions a week, one of which should be oily, from sustainable sources. But if the whole world, 7 billion people, ate that, bye-bye fish. It doesn't answer the question. And it's the same with meat. We have to address the dramatic reduction of meat consumption. And that means less production. And that means shifting policy guidelines and subsidies.
I'm doubtful that giving people, well, yeah, I agree with all that, of course, but I'm doubtful that giving people advice will bring about the change in culture, which I strongly agree with you about, which is what you want, and I agree strongly with. So I think things like, if you had the menu up normally here, I think Geeti now puts the vegetarian dishes at the top and the meat fish underneath. Is that right? Still doing that? So you give priority. You switch priorities. You get children used at school not to having meat with every dish, but maybe having pasta with a meat sauce. And you get used to people having meat-free days. So you start to change the culture. And I agree very strongly with something Tim said earlier. People think this is immovable and unchangeable, and actually it can change very, very quickly. In our lifetimes, it's gone from pretty good in post-war rationing period to a complete catastrophe, where our diets and food are killing us in large numbers and killing our children who live less long than we do. You could change it back just as quick or quicker.
The main thing that's probably going to shift this, by the way, we haven't said, and I must chip in on this as someone who writes on this, is antimicrobial resistance. If there's one thing that's going to bring the meat industry to its knees, is the fact that it accounts for 80% of antibacterial use. And this is now putting us in serious public health problem. So I speak as a rare social scientist who's a fellow of the Faculty of Public Health. And it's absolutely clear on that. Dame Sally Davis has done a great job as our Chief Medical Officer in England, and the Welsh and Scots likewise. But there is just drift, and it's the power of the meat industry that does not want that to happen. We have to address this intensive meat production and dairy production. If there's one reason to do it, it's to preserve antibiotics to save your life. I've had my life saved twice. It's quite useful, actually. Maybe you don't think so, but I quite like it.
Guy, could you
AMR.
envisage a time when you might be repackaging your meat in 70-gram portions rather than 200-gram portions? Say.
Depends how many people. I mean, the criteria.
Shush!
The criteria. God.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it would create some logistical issues in distribution. I think we might have to freeze some of it, but anyway, those are just logistical issues. But that's absolutely what we're encouraging people to do. And sorry? Yeah. I mean, I'm quite enheartened by our staff canteen, where we do serve 200 or 300 meals a day, and we have a new cook there who has been kind of slowly reducing the meat and then occasionally cutting it out altogether. And to start with, there was a real rebellion. I mean, we employ, all sorts, right from people who are working in IT and marketing through to, field hands and people packing and people of all nationalities. And there was, to start with, a real rebellion, but her food is so good. They've kind of gone quiet, and she's just using less and less, and some days there's no meat at all. She hasn't quite had the courage to deal with the bacon butty in the morning, but it will go. And I'm very encouraged by actually how accepting people are if the food is really good.
Forgive me interrupting earlier, I apologize. That's exactly what I was meaning, the renormalization of low meat. Better quality, pay for it, have it less. That's the goal people like us want. The issue is it's got to be led by cooks. That means you, me, in our homes. Don't buy it, actually. And that's a really tricky thing to say. But let me say this very categorically. If there was a war, this would happen very quickly.
I should actually say we do charge more for the meat meals as well. That probably helps.
Yeah, well, back to issues like tax.
Indeed. That was fantastic. Really interesting points made there. But I know that in the audience you have more questions and will want to pick up on things that perhaps you didn't feel were well explained enough. So if any of you have any questions, please do put your hand up. If you could wait until the microphone comes to you before you actually speak the question, just so that everybody can hear you well. That would be great. We have a lady over here.
Hi, I'm Daphne Reeder from Compassion and World Farming.
Daphne, would you like to come up here and speak from my microphone? No, we need a microphone. There we go.
Hold it close to you.
Yeah,
Close.
Like this?
yes, perfect.
So we are expecting a food and farming plan.
Sorry, just to say you're Daphne from Compassion and World Farming.
So we are expecting a food and farming plan from DEFRA. I wonder if any of this debate, are we to expect that any of this debate will be in this, and if not, how could it be part of this?
Let me answer it, because I bet I'm one of the only people who's read it. Don't get excited. I have, yeah, I didn't tell you. I was put into a room, the door was closed, and I was allowed to read it. Don't hold your breath. This is basically a government that believes the answer to British food is to export more of it. So let me put it really harshly, okay? That means we import the good stuff, fruit and vegetables, from water depleted areas like Spain and other areas on cheap land and cheap labour, and we sell heart disease.
So just to clarify,
This
what
is
products?
called British brand. The policy is brand British, sell more. But to be fair to the government, there is a huge problem. We have £21 billion food trade gap at the moment. We're importing £40 billion worth of food, mostly the good stuff, and exporting whiskey, biscuits, fat, meat. Fine, okay, it's good, but the gap has widened. So the government's approach is to try to push brand Britain, That's the core of the 25-year food strategy, around which there's some really interesting bits. Having appeared to be rude, there's some interesting bits. But you're from animal welfare, don't get excited.
A core problem is that in the department, as you probably know, there are different teams that represent the current state of the livestock industry. So there's a poultry team who don't accept that there's any difference between different poultry systems in terms of animal welfare. The cruelest chicken producer and the most wonderful organic free range from a DEFRA point of view are all the same, because the dominant forces in the chicken production would be upset if any government, this or previous governments, accepted that there were differences in standards, or differences for the animals. And there is no little team in DEFRA representing vegetarianism, and there are very few people in DEFRA who are prepared, certainly not amongst the politicians, to talk about climate change. So, no, it won't be in there. Even if I haven't read it like Tim, I know.
Well, but it wasn't that. Forgive me getting sort of heated earlier, but that's because there was, after the banking crisis of 2007-8, there was a rapid growth of thinking about food policy right across the Western world, and it happened here too. And it developed very interestingly, ending up with, I still think, an interesting document from DEFRA called Food 2030, which you might know. And that had in it a commitment for sustainable diets. It had in it a commitment that the food system needed to reduce its carbon footprint. And indeed, the Cabinet Office had reviewed the British food system in a very interesting, good report called Food Matters, which said, look, we've got to shift the food system. It's adding burdens to the National Health Service, it's being very bad for the environment, it's not being good economically. But it's messy, because actually food is the biggest employer in Britain. 3.6 million people work in food. Food manufacturing is the biggest manufacturing sector. Bigger than cars, bigger than electronics, bigger than, you name it. So this is a very important business and industry. You go to the States and it's food service, which is the big thing. The American dollar, food dollar that an American consumer spends, 31% goes to the food service. And that's basically cheap food everywhere. So are we going to be American or are we going to be European in our food culture? That's a really important issue for us to be thinking about as a shorthand. Does the DEFRA document address that? Well, if it's been rewritten in the last 10 days, I hope so. But I'm at a meeting where it's going to be talked about very widely by indeed the architects of it next week, and I don't think there have been any changes. So don't hold your breath. The answer is all of this, everything we've talked about this evening, is both about the evidence but also about pressure. People like you and your organisation are really important. But consumers, we're badly organised as consumers. We're individualised. We're targeted. And kids particularly targeted, which is why I'm a happy man about the sugar tax. For once, this is a nanny state today. Great. I like nannies. Call nannies parents and everyone suddenly likes them. The nanny state on food is good news. It's protecting your kid from being done over by £1 billion worth of food advertising every year. That has to be sorted. That's not meat. But the meat industry is part of that, targeting kids. The fast food industry is shocking, something.
Is there still an opportunity to feed in these recommendations into the food and farming plan?
No.
No.
Thank you. Do you have anything to add to that, Guy?
Well, I mean, the government often goes on about evidence-based policy making. According to the Chatham House report, and we've got one of the authors here tonight, so I hope he'll put me wrong if I get this. If I can put me right if I get this wrong. By 2050, with current projections of decarbonising the rest of our economy, as was discussed in Paris, but if the livestock consumption continues, our entire global sort of CO2 budget will be consumed by livestock by the age of 2050. Is that right, Anthony? I mean, how can that not be part of the environmental policy for agriculture. I mean, it's extraordinary.
And the government took, to its great credit, the British government signed and supported and pushed for the Paris Climate Change Accord. It was great. Actually, one could be really proud of them for doing that. But that means they've got to deal with food, because you cannot, for the reasons that Guy said. And if you don't know it, Anthony Froggatt here in the audience from Chatham House, the Chatham House report, Anthony, I can't remember the name of the report. What was it called?
Changing climate.
Changing diets. Just Google that, Chatham House. All of these issues are there. And one of the core messages that came out of this work, I declare I was an advisor to it, it was focus groups and opinion polls around 12 countries, China, Brazil, big countries, was that the consumers actually wanted to know. They wanted advice, they wanted support on this, and they're not getting it. And that's what campaigning groups need to be doing, working together. Environment, health, farming, right across the board. Together we'd be much stronger than we are at the moment.
Fantastic. Another question. Lance, on the left, yeah.
Hello, I'm Lance from the Vegetarian Society.
Could you hold the mic a bit closer?
Sorry.
Yeah. Lance from the Vegetarian
That's
Society.
You've come up with clear guidance for people on how much they want to reduce. How quickly do we need to change the systems?
How quickly do we need to change the systems? I think that's...
Well, very. For the reasons Guy just said. You know, you look at the figures on climate change, but I mean, Anthony, the Chatham House report was looking at climate change. You look at water. Now, there's plenty of water in the world. There's not a problem. The problem is the misuse of it. But then you look at biodiversity, the Millennium Ecosystems and Assessment of 2005, huge analysis by about 500 scientists around the world, just showed that this is one of the critical moments for the planet's capacity to breathe, literally as an ecosystem. We have got to start moving pretty quickly, actually.
Peter?
Yeah, I mean, of course, as fast as we can, we have to cut emissions from UK agriculture by 80% by 2050. That's the law. A law which...
The government might abolish the law. You know,
Well,
watch I'm serious.
yeah, no, well, I think
Might do that.
it does require fundamental changes in farming systems and diets to achieve an 80% cut in emissions from climate change emissions from it. And given that the pressures, as Tim said, of antibiotic abuse and the loss of the efficacy of antibiotics for human health is even more urgent than the climate change thing, I mean, we can't do this too fast.
Guy?
Well, I completely agree. I mean, the longer we leave it, the more abrupt the change is. It's going to have to be pretty abrupt anyway, but the more abrupt it's going to be. So, yeah, we better get on with it.
Another question. This gentleman in the blue jumper here.
Thank you. I think it's really encouraging to hear you talk so much about climate change. I was expecting that this discussion would be a lot about animal welfare, actually. So I think it's great that you're talking about climate change and the real urgency of it, because I think actually what hasn't got across so far out of the world outside of here is the urgency. And I would suspect that an awful lot of people here are already not eating that much meat. But it seems to me that when I go along to the supermarket, if I look at the shelves for a sandwich, most of them will be meat or fish. Very few, the choice is not that great for veggie or vegan. So I would suggest that what we need to do is get those people who are eating meat 2 or 3 times a day to eat a lot less meat by enrolling them in an idea which you said, Tim, of having meat only 2 or 3 times a week. And I would call having meat 2 or 3 times a week as being a feast. And what I would call, or what we would call it, is being a feastarian, because you're having a feast occasionally. But in a way, the way to get people into it is to say, you can have better food, have a decent piece of meat, which is what you're saying, but occasionally enjoy it, because you're not having it all the time. And actually you've got to pay for the actual benefit of animal welfare and climate change. So, thank you.
I think I completely agree. I think there's an issue with the whole term of treat, whereas treat used to be something that happened once a year, like Christmas, or possibly once a month, and we've got into a habit of thinking treats are something that happen every day. And I suspect that has to change, but I'm not meant to have an opinion here. Guy, as the retailer amongst us, do you see a way of
It's very
changing?
difficult to sell self-denial, I think. It's deeply unattractive. I don't like it. I don't think most people do. But I'm agreeing with you, really, that I think you've got, the point is to make
Feast days feast.
feast days feast with less meat, or better still, just to make vegetables really exciting, which they are. We don't need all that meat.
Sure, but I'm talking about that mass of people who are having meat 2 or 3 times a day at the moment and trying to shift them. I suspect a lot of us have already bought into having.
I think you're right. There is a sense of preaching to the converted.
But hang on a minute. Hang on. What I find the most aggravating thing about being a vegetarian is the number of conferences, meetings, other things I go to, where there are rays of sandwiches laid out, and what's disappeared by the time I get there? Every bloody vegetarian sandwich is gone, and there are these masses of uneaten meat. So you say that's what you see in the supermarket, but actually, given a choice, people go and nick the food that's meant for us. Us special. Shocking.
Actually, I think we should do what we do with smokers, actually. I mean, I do think pasties should be banned from a train, as indeed should those bacon butties. I mean, they are deeply offensive. I mean, I would really much rather have someone smoking in the carriage.
Another question. This lady at the back over here. Oh, right, thank you.
Hello, Lizzie Rivera from the Evening Standard. So I'm really happy with the 70-gram guideline. So as a consumer, when I'm going into a supermarket and I'm buying meat occasionally, I would like to talk about the animal welfare issue for a second, if that's okay. What brands am I looking for? Is organic enough when you're buying in a supermarket, or do we need? Is there a different guideline? Like, labelling is very confusing at the moment.
Tim.
And I was thinking the 2 farmers could deal with that. I mean, well, I always quote to my students, of whom there are a few here, good food shouldn't need labelling. Actually, the problem is labelling. I've had experience bitterly in my own life. Labelling itself becomes a battle. But labelling in a complex food system is one of the only ways we can find out. So I feel very paradoxical about labels. One of the reasons I like vegetables is they don't need labelling, actually. You can see them. Processed foods become needing a label.
Peter, is organic enough?
So I would say processed meat is where most of the label problem is.
I mean, organic's the best available at the moment. It's not perfect. There are lots of things we could do better. Guy and I were talking about the standards about the amount of grass ruminants need to eat. But compassionate world farming, somebody here happily quote, I've done a ranking of the animal welfare attributes of different labels and different systems, and Soil Association Organic comes out top. And I think that's, as I would, I suppose, speaking for a Soil Association, think that's a pretty fair independent assessment. But we could do better, I think, particularly with chickens, when the standards aren't as good as they could be. But they are, what people forget, I think, because so much of the industrial production is hidden, and you can't take children into a chicken factory or pig factory, let alone an abattoir, because of health and safety. They'll all get antibiotic resistance and die before they're 30. And probably not quite that, but you know what I mean. So actually, people see outdoor livestock and think, well, that looks quite good, but it's a bit muddy. And they forget that the alternative is a bare concrete cell, which is so awful that if you don't cut a pig's tail off, it will get eaten by other pigs because they're so bored, that's all they can do. I mean, the cruelty involved in some of the intensive systems, I still, even despite some improvements, it's unimaginable.
But just to go back to the question, which is organic enough if you're choosing meat in the supermarket?
Is it the best choice if you want the best animal welfare? Yes. Is it good enough? Could we do better? Yes.
Guy?
Yeah, no, I'd completely agree with that. I think all labelling, the issue is what are you trying to measure? And some of these things are very things we've been talking about tonight are very difficult to measure, and everyone has a different kind of balanced scorecard of values. But I would maintain, I'd agree with Peter really, that organic is the best show in town. I would like to see some things improved within it. I'd never argue it was perfect, but I think it's definitely the best thing available.
Another question. No, you said there's. Yes, hello.
Hi, thanks. Julie from Growing Communities. We run a small but perfectly formed box scheme farmers market over in Hackney.
Sorry, could you just say the name of the company again?
Growing Communities.
Growing Communities. Thank you.
I was going to ask a question to try to drill down into exactly how much of what kind of meat should we be eating, but I can see that we're not going to get. It's hard, very hard to give an answer to that. So I'm going to come at it the other way, which is that we obviously need to dramatically reduce the amount of food we're eating. Some people would argue that we should have no animals within our, our system would be more ecological if we had no animals within it. I would like to ask the farmers in particular, but Tim, obviously, you might want to have why should we include animals? Would the system be better and more ecological with animals in it? And why is that? People need to understand. If there is an argument around that, it would be really helpful for people to understand from the other side.
Guy.
Okay. I mean, the way we farm on our land is mostly grade 3 land. It's not terribly fertile. We just couldn't grow vegetables year after year. Even if we grew a green manure in between, and we do that sometimes, it will grow a spring crop and then a green manure through the autumn and early winter, and then another spring crop, a different one. It kind of just about works, but we do have to top it up with animal manure. In no way it would provide enough fertility. So, and when we need the animals to graze that grass, otherwise we're just going to have to keep mowing it off, which just seems ridiculous. We do sometimes do that. It builds up the fertility marginally more quickly, but without the animal manures, our farming system just wouldn't work on our farm. I mean, you might argue that we shouldn't be growing vegetables there. They all should be grown on the fens or on inherently more fertile soils. I would argue they wouldn't taste as good, but yeah, we are completely dependent on livestock within our systems, and I mean, jumping to the conclusion of this evening, perhaps, I definitely don't advocate a no livestock system, just much less of it, and leaving more room for wildlife on farms like ours. I think some of the land could sensibly be put back to trees and hedgerows and even nuts.
Good.
Pete?
I'm only here to pressurise him. Well, Guy's right, it's about fertility, but I would say back to the point of principle, it's about variety. I think the difficulty is we don't know quite what animals would look like in their ecological niche. What would putting domesticated meat-producing animals look like if they were in their ecological niche? That's a very philosophical question. That is actually what Julie Brown is asking. What she didn't realise that, but she does now. I think that's the issue, Julie. What is the ecological niche of animals?
Okay.
We've allowed them to...
Sorry, Peter, could I just chime in once more? I do, I mean, the best animals are the ones that don't belch and fart. So non-ruminants, monogastrics. But what we really need to do is find a way of feeding them other than grain and soya. So I would love to see research going into, well, I mean, we've already discussed using waste to feed pigs and whether we could make that acceptable within our food chain again. But are there other crops that there is research going on about feeding them silage to pigs? But I think that's what we really should be striving for.
Yeah.
Peter?
Yeah, and the research feeding silage to pigs, so conserved grass, has shown that you can do it really well. Again, you probably need to change the pig breed because modern breeds of pigs have been bred to eat this high thing. But going back to animal manure, because we farm also on poor soil, chalky, sandy soil in northwest Norfolk, and we would find it very difficult to maintain levels of phosphate and potassium without animal manures. So the three key things you need to grow crops, there are a lot of micronutrients and other things, but is nitrogen, phosphate and potassium. When I was a kid, all the fertilizer came in sacks from ICI, bags with NPK, nitrogen, phosphate and potassium. And the phosphate and potassium comes from animal manure. Now you could, if we got pretty much all the human waste, particularly the pee, the urine, back onto the land, probably do without most animals, but it would need pretty much all the waste. And if you think about the transport problems from Islington to Northwest Norfolk, or even King's Lynn to where we are. So, and the other thing to bear in mind is that this isn't just for organic farmers. Phosphates, the other key thing you need apart from the fossil fuel-based nitrogen as a conventional farmer, phosphates are all mined, they're non-renewable, they come from Morocco, they come from a part of the Sahara probably illegally occupied by Morocco, and supplies are peaking and probably starting to decline. So without livestock, we're going to have a real problem of where we get phosphate from in the years, decades to come.
I think we've got time for just one more question. So, who shall it be? Who's sticking their hand up? This lady here with the blue top on.
Hello, you wanted a short question, so mine is if we could make one change tomorrow that has the most impact to our own carbon footprint in the change of our diet, so that maybe meat, maybe not, what would it be?
It's very easy. Eat less.
Just eat.
If you eat less,
eat less of everything.
Stop. The British are eating too much.
I would say eat less meat, particularly non-organic meat.
Don't feed grain and soya to ruminants. But
yeah, all of that. There is a remarkable unanimity from the academics and from the policy watchers, and indeed from progressive farmers. You've got 2 years.
And it's worth saying, because Tim and I are both involved in this, with NGOs concerned with, we're in a group called Square Meal, with the RSPB, with Compassionate World Farming, with Friends of the Earth, with Tim, Soil Association, who else is it? National Trust, Wildlife Trust, anyhow, whole Food Matters, whole lot of groups. And we were asked at a conference we had when we launched a report by a guy from the Times, well, all right, you've all got together all these disparate groups. What was the main thing you disagreed about? And those of us on the panel looked at each other and bucket if we could remember a single thing we'd actually disagreed about. Seriously.
Yeah, nothing. There is consensus.
Well, that's a very good way to wrap everything up, with everybody agreeing. I know that this is a hugely, hugely complex issue, and that there is much, much more to be said on very many levels. The debate is continuing on the Riverford Facebook page. If you go to facebook.com/Riverford, please do join in, do speak your mind, and it would be great to continue the conversation. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you to all our panellists, and thank you to Guy particularly for hosting it, and to everybody at the Duke of Cambridge for putting us up so well. And I think it's time for supper.